The topic of my research paper is on the inclusion of people with physical disabilities in professional sports. So why did I choose this topic? Well, I've always had a love for sports. So when we started talking about the Casey Martin case in class, I instantly became very interested. In addition to going over that case, on social media and the news there have been constant coverage of this topic in particular. So the roadmap I will go through for my research paper will go from the government and the ADA to the progress that has been made for people with physical disabilities in the world of professional sports, to how these athletes now feel about the sport they compete in, to the recommendations I have to progress the movement. So the first topic we will look at is on the government and the ADA. The American with Disabilities Act required that most businesses and organizations make accommodations for their customers, members, and employees with disabilities. This was to create a more inclusive society for people with disabilities. This is where the concept of reasonable accommodation comes into play. However, until the Casey Martin case, the ADA being applied to sports was never an issue. In 2001, 11 years after the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, a case between the PGA and the professional golfer Casey Martin was brought to the Supreme Court. Casey Martin had a degenerative circulatory disorder that prevented him from being able to walk the length of the golf course during the competition, and if his condition was not properly accounted for, it could result in him having to amputate his legs. Because of this, he made a request for permission to use a golf cart. This is where the issue came to be after he was selected to participate in the PGA Tour. The fact that he needed a golf cart was quickly brought to the table. There was claims that walking injected fatigue into the skill of shot making, and therefore not walking would fundamentally alter the sport and be unfair, because he would not feel the same fatigue. Because of this, the PGA denied his request for a golf cart. According to the Supreme Court, under the ADA, Casey Martin's disorder constitutes a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. This made him allowed to make the request from the PGA, especially since he paid to participate. It was decided by the Supreme Court that in this case, Casey Martin did indeed have the rights to request and be given a golf cart, as it was determined that the fatigue Martin suffers from coping with his disability is greater than the fatigue his able-bodied competitors endure from walking the course. It was also determined that giving him a golf cart would not fundamentally alter the nature of the competition by any means. A great deal of debate came from a result of this case. Debate over whether or not the government was allowed or should be allowed to intervene in professional sports became a very controversial topic. Questions like should the ADA apply to professional sports organizations, what was considered a reasonable accommodation, and how will it affect the spirit of competition were key concerns. Realistically, though, it does not make sense for these organizations and companies to be left out. If professional sports could provide reasonable accommodations that do not fundamentally alter the sport itself, then why not allow for it? Doing so could potentially open up the market for their sport and make more athletes available. Although on the opposite end of the spectrum, not all sports can truly make accommodations for the disability experience. One of the most important tasks when involving people with disabilities into professional sports is creating a level playing field. This idea of a level playing field is to create an environment where all contestants have an equal chance. However, the most difficult part of this concept is being able to identify what the needs are of people with disabilities to create a level field of play. This is where the idea of reasonable accommodation comes into play, because this is how observations and considerations take place to see if fulfilling the need of a person with a physical disability would fundamentally alter the sport. Having said this, it is important to realize that not all sports can very easily make reasonable accommodations for people with physical disabilities. Sports organizations like the NFL and NHL that involve a great deal of physical contact cannot as easily provide reasonable accommodations for people with physical disabilities. Putting someone with a physical disability in a sport like this and trying to make accommodations for them would greatly alter the fundamentals of the game. Otherwise, it would greatly put the athletes in very dangerous situations. Yet, if the person with a physical disability does not necessarily need accommodations, then it is much more easy for them to access this sport. Now moving on to the progress that has been made. The world of professional sports has and is continuing to open up more for those with physical disabilities. And in some circumstances, reasonable accommodation has been used, and in others it has not. Oscar Pistorius was a South African runner who had both legs amputated below the knees. Therefore, he ran with the aid of prosthetic lower legs. The use of his prosthetics had given him what is considered the normal scope of functioning that somebody without a physical disability would have. Pistorius ran in the Olympics numerous times, including the Olympics and Paralympics. However, this came with great controversy. A study that was done found that Pistorius's prosthetics generated energy savings of over 25% more than the natural limbs of his competitors. Although, even with the controversy, he still went on with his career and won many awards and medals. Shaquem Griffin is another athlete with a physical disability that participates in professional sports. Shaquem was born with amniotic band syndrome, which causes damaged tissue and can cause fetal death. Due to this, he was constantly in great pain, and after being in so much pain at the age of 4, he tried to cut off his own left hand. This caused his parents to decide to have his left hand amputated. Griffin now credits his father for pushing him to be his best and not let his situation hold him back. Shaquem and his twin brother Shaquille both received scholarships to attend the University of Central Florida to play football. Once he got the starting job his junior and senior year on defense, he began to shine, which led to him receiving an offer to the NFL Combine.
The 141st pick in the 2018 NFL Draft, the Seattle Seahawks select Shaquem Griffin, linebacker, Central Florida.
He and his twin brother Shaquille, who was drafted a year prior by the Seahawks, now play on defense together as starters. No accommodations were made for Shaquem because he played in a position where he did not need one to be made. He played on defense where his goal was to tackle and hands were not necessarily required. The next person is Justin Gallegos. He is a little different than the other two because in October of 2018, he became the first athlete with cerebral palsy to sign with Nike. He was a runner all throughout high school, and he aimed to run in the University of Oregon track club when he got to college. Now as a junior, and on the team, he was not stopping there. He created the goal of breaking the 2-hour mark in a half marathon, which he accomplished by beating it with 3 minutes and 59 seconds remaining. This is an impressive task for anybody, regardless of whether or not they have a physical disability. After signing his 3-year deal, Justin posted on Instagram that growing up with a disability, the thought of becoming a professional athlete is, as I have said before, like the thought of climbing Everest. It is definitely possible, but the odds are most definitely not in your favor. Hard work pays off. He and Nike have since collaborated and are in the works of creating a running shoe that is beneficial for people with disabilities called the Fly Ease. Through these 3 people, we are able to see that people with physical disabilities are gaining access to all aspects of professional sports that athletes without physical disabilities have easily accessed for so long. For this area, I am focusing on a study that was done on swimmers with physical disabilities at the Paralympics. They were asked what it meant to be a swimmer and what being a professional athlete meant to them. One swimmer stated, "As I got into swimming more and more, I felt like I had a place more and more." Another said, "I think I became a swimmer rather than just someone with a disability swimming up and down." A third stated, "Your disability is pretty visual in swimming, but I kind of learned to be proud of it. And when there's a whole 8 of you that have the same disability standing behind the block, people aren't just watching you. If I was in town, people notice, but when there's 8 of you, they don't notice. They see you as a whole group. So when I race, I'm kind of part of a group, not an individual." All of these comments prove that people with physical disabilities are very happy to be able to participate in professional sports, and that it means a lot to them. So closing out my presentation, I have a few recommendations. My first is to further the growth of inclusion for people with physical disabilities into the world of sports through accommodation. And in order to do so, accepting accommodations that do not change the fundamentals of the sport should be allowed and greatly considered. People with disabilities want a fair shot at being able to compete professionally, so as long as they can without completely altering the basics of the sport, why not let them? Lastly, allowing for occasional government intervention and the enforcement of the ADA in professional sports can help further the inclusion of people with physical disabilities into sports where accommodations are easily available but are refused. And by doing these things, people with physical disabilities will overall gain greater access to the world of professional sports.